Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and this is What If, Why Not, How? Where I ask people who have interesting stories and ideas questions that are on my mind. Joining me today is Gregory Frost. Greg is a celebrated author of fantasy, horror, and science fiction. Among his many accolades, his book Shadow Bridge, which you have to read, was an American Library Association Best Fantasy Novel pick. Greg has won, I have to read the list, it's too long. Greg has won an Asimov Readers Award in collaboration with Michael Swanwick. I would have loved to have been a fly on that wall.
Oh, yeah.
And has been a finalist for the Best Novel or Best Short Story for the World Fantasy, Stoker, Nebula, Hugo, James Tree, International Horror Guild, and Theodore Sturgeon Awards. He taught the fiction writing workshop at Swarthmore College for 18 years and is a founding member of the Philadelphia Liars Club. In conjunction with Bookview Cafe, he has published the short story collection, The Girlfriends of Dorian Ray, great title, originally a Golden Griffin collection, and the Celtic fantasy novel Tane. His latest novel, another one you have to read, Rhymer, is the first in a 3-book series from Baen Books. Rhymer, reimagines Thomas Rhymer, a 12th century legendary poet hero of Scottish balladry, and then pits him against immortal evil elves. We've got to talk about this, Greg. Gregory Frost, welcome.
Thank you. You think there's a different kind of elf, do you? No, anyway.
Let's get the audience in a good mood. Could you please share a short reading from Rhymer, please?
I'll be happy to. I've been reading at conventions and whatnot the same opening section of the book over and over again, and I got tired of doing that. So I'm going to read the opening section for what I think of as Act 2 in the book, which is a chapter called The Night. So it's not very long. I'll just give you the opening scene. The knight arrived at the home of the tenant-in-chief, whose name was Carden, on a fine spring afternoon. The knight was dirty and tired, as were his 2 horses. Outside the palisade gate, he dropped down from the saddle and then, leading the horses, walked across the immense open yard to the keep. 7 people in the yard paused in their duties to watch him pass by. One, nearest the keep and with a face that reminded the knight of a peregrine, turned and hurried up the steps and inside it. The knight wore a worn leather shoulder cape over his brown tunic. He was bare-legged, and the ragged edge of a pair of brays showed just below the tunic's hem. He left a sword, 2 bows, and 2 quivers on the second horse, along with a bedroll and an old weathered satchel holding his mason's tools. The weapons, his bearing, and the way his blue eyes, heavy-lidded with fatigue, took in everything around him, bespoke his lethal occupation. The tenant-in-chief met him at the steps up the motte well before he reached the keep. Dressed in a lightweight belted tunic and rolled-down boots, Carden had bowed legs and the hunched posture of someone who had spent his life bent over the mold board of a plow. He was balding in the center of his hair, but he still had most of his teeth. The knight nodded deferentially as he drew from his tunic a small parchment which he held out to Carden, who unfurled and read it. It was simple and clear, a document of scutage that assigned Carden responsibility to make good on a debt owed by King David to the knight for his service in defending of the Empress Matilda. The king's seal was affixed, testament to the pledged fealty. Carden lowered the document enough to study the weary knight more carefully. No more than 20 or so years of age, surely, with strands of black hair across his eyes, which shone like chips of sky seen through the naked branches of winter trees. Although he was smiling vaguely, doing his best to seem unthreatening, the young knight had about him the air of someone used to the unexpected, the violent, and the quick. Someone who had survived by instincts for so long that he no longer noticed he had them. Even here, where there was no situation to threaten him. Plus, he had a scar along the hairline on the right side of his head, mostly hidden beneath the shaggy hair. He is dangerous, Carden thought, and for a moment considered sending for Goss Patrick, the sheriff of Roxburghshire. But the document was real. Carden had promised to pay scutage as a form of tax on behalf of up to 3 men who had fought for the king. This was the first who'd ever applied. Most, as he well knew, did not survive to take advantage of the offer. While he hadn't exactly depended upon it, admittedly he'd half expected never to have to pay any scutage at all. 2 ox gangs of land vergate, he said, handing the parchment back. He owned a ploughgate himself, much of it lying fallow this year. A vergate was not a lot, and anyway, the knight as tenant would be expected to share some of what he grew and raised with Carden. Aside from that, it might not be a bad idea to have a young and skilled soldier about, and much nearer at hand than Gospatrick, who, if sent for immediately, might arrive in a few hours if it suited him. Very good parcels I have, both Fermentun on a slope near the Teviot, and Sheelings that include huts higher up where you can graze your livestock. I imagine in order to plough you'll be acquiring at least a few oxen, purchased perhaps from him. The knight nodded somewhat uncertainly, as if the actuality of farming had not occurred to him before now. What's your name then, husbandman? Tamas, sir. Tamas Lynn. Well then, Tamas Lynn. Are you from Peebleshire? No, Ayrshire, sir. Ah, well, I shall ride along with you in your plot. We'll choose and mark out between us the right way. He went back up into the keep. The knight stood a while observing the keep and the walls and the various wood outbuildings, the main hall where the family would live, and beside it the cooking house and a weaving shop, a stable that looked to include a smithy's or at least a farrier's workshop. So intently did he contemplate the 13 buildings within the palisade that a girl carrying a basket of 8 eggs almost collided with him. She jumped back startled as quickly as he did. She wore a blue gown with flared sleeves and an embroidered waist belt and hip girdle. Her brown hair was braided. The tips fell past her waist. He counted 16 braidings on one side and 17 on the other, but restrained the urge to mention this. You should be careful, sir, she said sharply. Forgive me, I do try to be. He looked upon her with his head slightly bowed. Her face was flushed as if with fury. She glanced at his horses, at his weapons. You're a soldier, then? I have been before now. He tried to make out whether she was truly angry with him, though he couldn't fathom a reason. Finally, he added, I think you walk very quietly. Her eyes flashed for a second, meeting his, and her cheeks reddened darker. And you, I think, daydream, she said. He stepped aside to let her pass. She curtsied and then started across the yard to the cooking house. To her back, quietly, he said, If I'm dreaming you, may I never wake up. She could not have heard, and kept walking, but then paused just before she entered, and looked him over once more, whether or not with hostility he couldn't tell. Carden, emerging by then, came down the steps, and although the knight asked nothing, he said, My daughter, Janet. Carden returned to him the parchment, tucking it back inside his tunic. The knight felt that he was tucking away that name for safekeeping as well. So that's the end of that scene.
Wow. What fabulous descriptions and prose. That's great stuff. Thank you. Thank you for sharing us. Now, please tell us about the original Thomas the Rhymer. It's this big legend that a lot of folklorists know, and you've taken it in a totally different vein, but I'd love to hear about the original first.
Well, the original Thomas the Rhymer ballad is about a young man who meets the queen of Elfland, and she takes him for a ride, basically gets him up on the back of her horse and takes him to Elfland. And in the process of riding to Elfland, they go through the regions of hell, they go through all of these places, et cetera, and then she apparently brings him back. And there's a historical character, Thomas Learmount or Learmount, or, there are half a dozen names attached to him, who apparently really existed in the village of Ercildoune, which is now Earlston in Scotland, and is famous for speaking these weird riddles, just spouting out these very strange riddles and rhymes, all of them prophetic if you can figure out what they mean. And they're as obscure as you can possibly get. It's like listening to Nostradamus, spew nonsense. So I took the ballad character and married him to another ballad character, which is actually this opening that you just heard with the knight. He's changed his name because he and his friend have fled the area and gone off and been soldiers for 5 years. And he's come back with, the parchment of scutage, just to be a farmer and essentially try to kind of disappear into the landscape. Mm-hmm. And where was I going with this? I can't remember. He comes back, and just to protect himself because the elves are in society and all around us and everywhere, and he doesn't know where they are, and he doesn't know who he's talking to on any given day in terms of whether they're an elf or not. He has changed his name and called himself Tamas Lin, or Tam Lin. And that's the other ballad that I've kind of folded into the Thomas the Rhymer ballad. And from my perspective, and I'm sure I'm not the first person that's thought of this, but it's the first time I've seen it done in a work of fiction. The Ballad of Tam Lin, I think, is the second half of the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, because it's a story about a woman named Janet, a young woman named Janet, who meets this enchanted knight in the woods in a place called Carter Hall, which is a region that's maybe 10, 15 miles away from Erceldon, where Thomas the Rhymer, the ballad, takes place. They're very, very close together geographically. It's kind of remarkable. And he's already been captured by the Queen of Elfland, or the Queen of Fairies, and she plans to sacrifice him as a tithe to Hell. And if Janet wants to rescue him, when he appears on this particular night, led by the Queen of Fairies, she should jump up and tackle him and pull him down off his horse. And no matter what happens, hold on to him. And so, being the brave woman she is, as women are in ballads, she does exactly that. She tackles him off the horse, and he turns into all sorts of monstrous creatures and things, and she does not let go. She's not frightened by what happens. And finally, the queen gives up and says, "You can have him. I can't work with this," and leaves. And so Janet wins Tam Lin, and they go off presumably and live happily ever after. So it just seemed to me like it's the same character. Thomas and Thomas Rhymer's full name in some of the stories, some of the pieces you can read on him, is Thomas Lindsay Rhymer de Erceldon. So the Lindsay and the Lynn seem like they're, Thomas Lindsay versus Tam Lin. It's just too perfect.
Yeah.
So truth or not, I stole it, and I used that as a kind of a basis for shaping the first part of this story.
And you've made him immortal.
And I've made it. Well, I didn't do that. The elves did that. It's their fault.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Yes. They should never have done that.
Characters tend to do that, don't they? They just take over and they decide what they're going to do.
And it's kind of like Michael Moorcock referred to the eternal champion, and it's sort of an archetype that I don't know if Moorcock created him, but certainly stamped his shape on the idea of an eternal champion. And that's kind of what Thomas is. He's somebody who lives through time in order to battle these creatures that he knows are trying to destroy the world, and nobody else seems to know anything about that.
And one other detail you forgot to mention is that the elves can appear like humans, that they are skinwalkers. And that's...
Well, yes, they can glamour themselves to look like anybody at all, and they even have devices which... This comes out very late in the first book and is sort of the center of the second book, which sort of core out any human being that they select to allow them to inhabit that person and walk around in that person's body, but the person is dead. So the longer they live in the body, the worse it is when they're finally kicked out. It's sort of very icky.
So you've married your fantasy writing to your horror writing, in other words.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
You have a hallmark not only of great storyteller, but I guess the word would be wry sense of humor.
I'll take that. Yes.
How much of this book was came to you through going, oh wow, I've got this mischievous idea of what I can do with these guys? Or was it simply a very serious exploration of folklore that came to you and then tickled your funny bone as well as your storytelling craft?
I don't know the answer to that, actually. I'm not sure which came first, the chicken or the egg here. I do tend to drift into humor,
Yes.
even black humor, if you will,
Yes.
really dark humor. And this certainly warrants that kind of treatment in my estimation. So I couldn't imagine writing it and not conceiving of ridiculous, fantastical, and as you say, mischievous things to embed in the story. Yeah.
Well, it comes through, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
This isn't the first time you've based your fantasy fiction on reimaginings of legends. Your Tane, your book Tane, is a retelling of the Ulster cycle of Celtic mythology. Yes. Ficture's Brides, for instance, is based on the stories of Bluebeard, which is really the first thing I read when my deceased husband reviewed Ficture's Bride.
He wrote a great review of that book.
Yeah, yes. He loved it. He loved your work.
I loved his review. Well, thank you.
What is it like to choose to invade and reshape such beloved, well-established tales? First of all, it has to take guts, but it also you have to cloak yourself in all of it and yet deviate it. What is your process? What does it feel like, and how close do you hold on to your research once you've gone there?
It's a very immersive process, I think, and I've come to appreciate that more and more over the years. When I wrote Toyn, from the Irish, the Ulster cycle, the stories of Cuchulainn, I spent something like 8 years doing research, which included, in that case, because I'm insane, bicycling Ireland, bicycling the route of the cattle raid as it takes place in the book, all the way to from Connacht to Armagh, and just to see the landscape, just to be there. And I would find when I was writing that book that I would write for hours, and I would suddenly like come back to the world, and I felt like I'd lived in another century. I'd been in the Bronze Age for 3 hours or something.
Wow.
And there was this sort of weird separation between the universes I was inhabiting. And I found that to be true more and more with books like this one is set in 12th century Scotland. Mm-hmm. The sequel to Reimer is set in 13th century England, and the sequel to the sequel is set in 16th century London. So wow. Every day of writing those books is sort of like disappearing into the past, into the history. So that answers, I guess, part of your question. The other part about taking these stories that already have shapes. I think, first of all, fairy tales in particular are wonderful stories to borrow from. Even if you strip down and throw out everything that is recognizable in the fairy tale, the armature that you're left with, the structure you're left with, has been time tested, because in oral tradition, these things have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and passed along and retold and embellished and retold. So you've got a dozen different versions of Bluebeard, as you were saying. There's lots of Bluebeard stories. So you can take fairy tales and do all kinds of amazing things with the stories without even referencing the fairy tale that you're necessarily tackling. Mm-hmm. And I was introduced to that by two editors, Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling, who were compiling, editing a series of adult fairy tale retellings. Books were Snow White, Blood Red, Black Swan, White Raven, things like that. So they did a series of about 5 or 6 of those. And lots of people contributed, Jane Yolen and Ellen Kushner and Delia Sherman and a whole bunch of other writers. picked different fairy tales and wrote some kind of gloss or answer response to the fairy tale. And then Terry expanded that into novels, which borrowed from the fairy tales, but then kind of threw open the door to where you could write any kind of story you wanted using that material. So Ellen Kushner again wrote a Thomas the Rhymer novel, in fact. So I didn't want to write anything that looked like the Thomas the Rhymer that Ellen wrote, and I didn't want to write anything that looked like the ballad itself, because that's what she was working with as source material. So I kind of turned the ballad on its head. In the ballad, Thomas is taken by the queen to Elfland. In the novel that I wrote, it's his brother that's taken. And that's his motivation for pretty much everything that happens for the rest of his life, is that they've stolen his brother away from him, and he's watched this happen and could do nothing about it.
That's a great motivation. Yeah. I'm going to go into another direction, because I'm fascinated by your teaching, that you taught fiction for many years at Swarthmore College. And teaching, of course, is one of those processes that the students come and go, but there's this thread that happens constantly. And I'm curious, what were some of one of the most important things that you learned about writing from teaching writing to all these students?
No, you don't put me on the spot or anything like that.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Well,
I mean, talk to me about your teaching. What is it that it drew you? Every time I'd hear you talk about your teaching, you were animated about it. So there had to have been something that it gave you as a writer and as a person. That and that's where I was curious with that question.
Well, it kind of opens the door to your rethinking fiction and your relationship to fiction anyway, because you're presenting that relationship to students year after year after year. And I didn't like working, and I never did work from a boilerplate, where we're just doing the same thing every year.
Right.
Teaching pushed me to read stories that I probably would never have read by writers I might not have ever heard of or paid attention to, because I wanted the students to be exposed to as much different kinds of fiction and what was going on right now. Because to me, you can teach a workshop going back to the, if you're teaching a science fiction workshop, you can go back to the great pulp tradition writers of the 50s and the writers of the 60s and such, but that doesn't help students figure out what to write now or what they should be writing now or what anybody else is writing now. So you kind of have to thread the needle. You can show them all this stuff, which is where it all came from, but you also have to show them these are the people you're competing with. These are the stories that are being published right now. These are the writers that are held up as exceptional right now, and you should know them as well as the traditions of fantasy and science fiction and that sort of thing, if it's fantasy. So for me, it's almost like reimagining the process year after year, and I would learn things teaching them that I would then add to the course and would be in there next year. So it was always a snowballing effect. It's like, well, they don't need this piece of information anymore. They need this piece of information. Right. So it's like you keep honing it and sharpening it and coming back to it and trying to almost boil the whole thing down to the simplest information you can give everybody. That's also the essential information that they have to have.
It would have been fun to sit in on one of your classes. I wish I had at some point. I love that you were getting them to read outside their comfort zone. I find that it's so important to keep things from getting stale for writers. I think and putting the butts of chair and hand on keyboard. Those are the two important things that I feel one has to do as a writer. Now, this is a trilogy, correct?
Yes.
So do you have an estimate when the second book is going to be coming out?
In theory, it comes out next June or July. I haven't heard a specific date, but they originally said it would be a year between each of the books.
Great.
So,
and can you give us a little hint about where Thomas is going? What's up for Thomas from the second book?
Well, I will tell you that Thomas in the second book, the second book is approximately 100 years later than the first book. And I will just simply say that in it, Thomas accidentally becomes Robin Hood.
There's that mischief again.
Yep.
I love it.
Yeah.
So, what are you working on now? Are you working on the third book, or?
I am. I'm working on the third book, and the third book is significantly different than the first two, for a host of reasons. One, because 300 years have passed, so it's like reimagining the character entirely. It's like, what has he done in 300 years? How has he come to terms with what he is, who he is, and what his goal, if you want to call it that, is in life. And a lot has changed because of that. So this is somebody who's kind of come into his own because he simply survived this long, and kind of gotten comfortable with the idea that he's going to just keep, being there. He's not going to disappear.
Right.
And he's learned to go away and come back as the cousin or the son or whoever, or as a completely different person with a completely different name. He's amassed a small fortune. He's kind of a different person than he was in the first two books because of all these things that have happened to him.
He sounds like a character that you could keep writing about if you really wanted to. I can imagine readers would like to see what happens to him in the 18th century or the 19th century.
Well, if I were writing the fourth book, my plan was, such as it was to put him in the Lost Colony in Virginia, which just seemed like a natural place to go, So you can just look at all the things he can do down through history, and even in the stuff I'm writing right now in the third book, he even references in one place having met and conversed with Joan of Arc, simply by lying to the guard and telling the guard that she wanted him to hear her confession. Of course, he's glamored himself, so he appears as somebody else, and he just goes into her cell and he can talk to her. So he's kind of this Zelig-like figure that's been in these important battles in these important locations throughout history, and he's sort of knows a lot of things that you wouldn't expect anybody to know, because your lifespan at that time was about 40 years if you were lucky. Not a lot of people live past 40.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to reading the next two books in the series. Where can folks find your books, Greg?
Well, hopefully you can find the books like Thomas the Rhymer, in any bookstore anywhere. And if they don't have it, damn it, demand that they get copies of it. The ebook reprints of Toyne and The Girlfriends of Dorian Gray are available from Bookview Cafe, a online cooperative, which also has a lot of other science fiction and fantasy writers, romance writers, and even a few horror writers in there too, who have kind of moved from traditional publishing into a kind of self-publishing maintenance of their backlist while they're still writing new titles and finishing series for fans who, had read some of their books in a particular series, and the series got cut off by the publisher, and they're making sure that doesn't end the series and doesn't leave their readers, hanging in space.
Great idea. Well, thank you very much, Greg. It was great. It's always great chatting with you. Gregory Frost's newest novel is Rhymer, and I highly recommend it for its wondrous storytelling and great characters. Another place you could find out more about Greg is to go to gregoryfrost.com, one word. You can also connect with him on Facebook as Gregory Frost 1, because there is only one.
Thank you.
On Instagram as Gregory _score 1. And Mastodon is at Gregory Frost at wandering.shop. Yes.
Yeah.
As for me, my new collection of feminist science fiction, which is called A Being Woman, was recently published by Noble Fusion Press. And another new book, Daughters of Eve, an essay-based discussion workbook that uses the stories of the women of the Hebrew Bible to explore who we are today, will be released in December by Baen Publishing. As always, you can connect with me at sallywienergrotta.com. excuse me, or on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and probably soon on Blue Sky and Substack if I can find time to get those going, and maybe get rid of Twitter, I believe. Nice. I look forward to hearing from all of you and from chatting with you again, Gregory. Maybe we'll have another talk about the next book. Thank you. Thank you very much.